In this chapter, we're going to have a look at a couple of examples for rooks behind the pawn, and that's what you need to know in all rook endgames. So you always want to have the rook behind the pawn because there it just supports the pawn the best. The pawn always wants to move forward towards the 8th rank where it can become a new queen, and the rook always supports the pawn best from behind. The second best option would be probably from the side, and the least best option is to be with the rook in front of the pawn, which sometimes is also enough to secure a win, but in most cases you would really prefer to have the rook behind the pawn. So if that's possible, you in most cases want to get a position like that where the rook supports the pawn from behind. In the first example, material is equal, but just because the rook supports this passed pawn that nicely, white actually has a winning position here. And a common theme which we see quite often when it comes to this rook behind the pawn, then often the defending side is actually in Zugzwang in many cases. And that's also how white wins this position, by just waiting. And at some point, black has to move backward with the king, and then white can move forward with his king. Black could still throw in a move like b4, but just a move like b3, for example, putting black into Zugzwang once again. When the rook moves backwards, then we can always push the pawn forwards. And if the king goes back, then king d4 comes, king d6, and once again Zugzwang with a move like rook f2. At some point, the rook has to move. Otherwise, if the king moves again, then the king just enters on e5 and the pawn will move forward. So, for example, rook f8, and then f6 comes. And another important detail is here that the pawn endgames are just winning. If black takes, then the pawn endgame, king takes d5, and the king will pick up the pawn on b4, and black's king will not reach the magical b6 square in time, and therefore white is winning. In the next example here, it is black to move, and we see that this a6 pawn could be quite useful in the very future, but pushing it right away with a5 would allow white to actually win that pawn. After rook a7, there's no way to defend the pawn for black, and now black would be actually in the big defensive task. But instead, black can play rook a8 first. Once again, putting the rook behind the pawn, and now black is ready to just start pushing this pawn down the board, and white has quite a difficult defensive task now. Probably should stop the pawn right away with a move like rook b3 and then going to a3, but let's just have a look at the variation rook c7, which would go after the pawn on c5, but that would already be too slow because black's pawn is now just too fast, and in the very end, after the pawn reaches the a2 square after rook a1, black even has a concrete win with the move rook b8, because no matter what white does, rook b1 is going to follow in the next move. If white takes on a2, it's even going to come with checkmate, and black is winning. In the next example here, we see that white has this very powerful pawn center, but at the moment, whenever white advances the pawns, the king can still blockade them. Still, those two pawns are enough to win the game if the rook supports them in a correct manner. Also note that the king is already on b6, where it can actually also support the pawns quite well. So white should start with d6 check, king e6, which still blockades the pawns for now, but now white has a move rook d1, and all of a sudden there's this huge threat of d7. The only way that black can stop it at the moment is by going rook c8, so that after d7 he has rook d8. If black would start with king d7, white has the breakthrough with e6, just removing the king from the d7 square, and after king takes e6, just d7, and white is going to have a new queen on the next move. So rook c8 still stops the d-pawn from promoting for now, but after d7, rook d8, now the king comes into play as well with king c7, and after king e7, there's still another nice winning plan, just e6, now that the rook is free to leave the d-file. Otherwise, if the rook leaves the d-file, then the d7 pawn would be hanging. But after e6, the king can never take on e6, because then the rook on d8 would be hanging. And if black plays something like g4, for example, then white can just, in all calmness in the world, just pick up all of the pawns, and there's actually nothing that black can do. White is going to take those pawns, and at some point, white is able to break through and make a new queen on d8. In the next example, once again, level material, and it looks quite drawish, but here as well, black has the strong move rook b6, which puts the rook behind the pawn and supports it very, very well. And all of a sudden, b2 followed by b1 is a huge threat. If black were to take on g5, that would not be enough. For example, after rook a8 check, king c7, rook a7 check. Now white is just drawing. There's just not enough material left. And after b2, rook f1 just stops the pawn and a draw is very near. So that would not be enough for a win, but instead rook b6 is. And after rook a1, which stops the pawn for the moment, we see a similar scenario to what we saw in an earlier example, that the pawn endgames are just going to be lost after king e7. If white goes toward the b2 pawn and takes, then those pawn endgames are just lost because the white king is way too far away. And apart from that, if white goes for something like king c5, then after rook b3, d6, check, king d7, king d5, once again, the king is slowly gonna get harassed, and at some point black is going to be able to win the pawn on d6. For example, here after rook c6, check, king d4, black can take with the check and then go back to the b6 square, and at some point the king is just gonna go towards the c2 square and gonna win the game. If white goes to the b5 square, then rook c8 is another nice idea, because white cannot take on b2 because of the skewer. After rook b8, black wins the rook. In the next example, here it is once again white to move, and still you need to bring the rook behind the pawn, because if you would start by playing c7, then black can make a draw by playing rook c3, and there's no way to strengthen the pawn and to actually being able to promote it. So c7 would be too early, but instead there's quite a nice tactical motive, starting with rook d4 check, and after king b5, now rook c4, an idea which we see quite often, this sort of tactical idea by bringing the rook behind the pawn. And the case here is that black cannot take comfortably, because after c7 there's no way to stop the pawn. Actually, the king is in black's way, because now rook c3 does not does not prevent promoting the pawn on c8. The same also applies if black goes king c5. Still rook c4 does win, because after king c4 we have the same position. After c7 white is winning. The final example features a game between Wei Yi and David Howell, and here, after the move rook e8 was played, David Howell showed a very nice technique by winning this position. And once again, this pawn is going to decide the game, but you need to support it by bringing the rook to the b6 square. David Howell started by going b4, just pushing the pawn forward, and after e4, king c5, e5 trying to get counterplay. Now was the critical moment, and David Howell played the move rook b6, once again placing the rook behind the pawn and getting ready to just push that pawn down to the b1 square. White can try king d2, b3, king c1, b2 check, and king b1, so at least blockading the pawn for now. But after king d5, now the problem is that also the pawns on the king set are quite loose, and David Howell just went after them, captured the pawn on g3, and pawn on e5 is going to fall pretty soon, and of course also the pawn on h4. And in the end, white is going to end up being 2 pawns down. The pawn on e5 is just going to fall at any moment. King e5 already would be a bit too early, because then white can capture on g6, but instead David Howell played the move rook g4, and after e6 now, white has to move the pawn, otherwise king e5 is a big threat, since now the pawn on g6 is protected. And after e6, now just king f6. For example, king e3, rook g5, and now the pawn on e6 is just going to drop at any moment, rook e5, and black wins, because black is going to capture on e6 on the next move. So once again, very important to place the rook behind the pawn here. Rook b6 was a very nice find by the British Grandmaster David Howell.
Access Chess Enigma's free sample lessons. Enjoy videos, interactive exercises, and a digital board to practice anywhere on any device. Sign up for free and start improving your chess from home today.